The October rain turned Seattle's streets into rivers of neon and shadow, each droplet catching the harsh fluorescent glow from the hospital behind her. Zara Williams pulled her scrubs closer against the cutting wind, exhaustion weighing down her shoulders like lead blankets after another 16-hour shift in the emergency department. Her sneakers splashed through puddles that reflected the city's harsh beauty, a kaleidoscope of light and darkness that matched her mood perfectly. She wondered sometimes if other people felt this bone-deep tiredness, this constant ache of caring too much for strangers who pass through her hands like water. Wherever you're watching from tonight, do you ever feel that weight of carrying others' pain? Comment below and let me know where you're tuning in from. The shortcut through Pioneer Square would save her 20 minutes, maybe more with the late buses running behind schedule. Zara turned down the narrow alley between the old brick buildings, where shadows pooled like spilled ink and the smell of rain mixed with something darker, more dangerous. Her nursing instincts had taught her to trust her gut, and tonight something felt wrong in the air, electric and threatening. That was when she heard it, a child's voice, high and terrified, cutting through the steady drum of rain against fire escapes. Her exhaustion vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp clarity that came with crisis. Zara pressed herself against the wet brick wall and moved toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs. The scene unfolded before her like a nightmare painted in streetlight and shadow. 3 men in dark clothing surrounded a small boy, maybe 7 years old, pressed against a dumpster with nowhere to run. The child wore expensive clothes, a pristine navy coat that probably cost more than her monthly rent, but his face was streaked with tears and rain, his dark eyes wide with terror. The men spoke in low, harsh voices, words she couldn't catch, but understood perfectly through tone and body language. This was a kidnapping in progress, and the boy was clearly from a family with money. Serious money, if the cut of his clothes and the desperation of his captors meant anything. One of the men reached for the child, and Zara's training kicked in with crystalline precision. She had spent years dealing with emergencies, thinking fast under pressure, making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. This was just another crisis, just another person who needed her help. Zara grabbed the fire alarm mounted on the wall beside her and yanked it with all her strength. The piercing wail filled the alley like a banshee's scream, bouncing off the brick walls and shattering the dangerous quiet. The men spun toward the sound, confused and suddenly uncertain. In that moment of distraction, Zara stepped into the light and called out with the voice she used in trauma bays, commanding and absolutely confident. "Stop right there. You need to back away from that child immediately." The men turned toward her, and she saw the calculation in their eyes, weighing her threat level, deciding whether she was worth eliminating. But the fire alarm had done its work, and she could already hear voices from the street, people responding to the emergency signal. The kidnappers looked at each other, then at the boy, then back at her. The smallest one, clearly the leader, said something sharp in a language she couldn't identify, and the 3 men melted back into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. Professional criminals knew when to cut their losses, and a public emergency response was more attention than their operation could handle. Zara rushed to the boy, dropping to her knees beside him in the filthy alley. He was shaking, his small hands pressed against his mouth as if he could hold back the terror by sheer force of will. She had seen that look before, in the emergency department, when children came in after trauma, that wide-eyed shock that said the world had suddenly become unsafe. "Hey," she said softly, using the gentle voice she reserved for pediatric patients. "You're okay now. Those men are gone. My name is Zara, and I'm a nurse. I help people, especially brave kids like you." He looked at her with those enormous dark eyes, assessing her the way children do when deciding whether an adult can be trusted. There was something unusual about his composure, a gravity that seemed far too mature for his age. When he finally spoke, his English was perfect but accented, each word carefully chosen. "Are they really gone?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're really gone," Zara confirmed, pulling out her phone to call 911. "But we need to get you somewhere safe and figure out how to contact your family." "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Minjun," he said, then seemed to catch himself, as if he had revealed more than he intended. Zara noticed the hesitation but didn't press. In the emergency department, she had learned that traumatized patients would share information when they felt safe, not when pushed. Instead, she focused on the practical concerns, checking him over for injuries with practiced efficiency. Minjun had a small scrape on his palm and a bruise forming on his wrist where someone had grabbed him, but nothing serious. His clothes were indeed expensive, tailored and perfectly fitted, and now that she looked closer, she could see a small embroidered symbol on his coat collar, elegant and distinctly Korean. The rain continued to fall around them as they waited for the police, and Zara found herself studying the boy more carefully. He carried himself with unusual composure for someone who had just been terrorized, and his eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost adult. There was something about him that suggested he came from a family accustomed to danger, prepared for exactly this kind of situation. When the patrol cars arrived, their red and blue lights painting the alley in harsh primary colors, Minjun moved closer to Zara instinctively. The responding officers were professional and kind, but they represented authority, and authority clearly made him nervous. He answered their questions in monosyllables, giving them nothing useful about his attackers or his background. The lead officer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, crouched down to Minjun's level. "Can you tell us your last name, honey? We need to call your parents and let them know you're safe." Minjun looked at Zara, then back at the officer, and shook his head slowly. "I cannot," he said simply. "They will find me." The officer's expression grew more serious. She exchanged a look with her partner that Zara recognized from the hospital. The look of professionals realizing a situation was more complicated than it first appeared. This wasn't a simple attempted kidnapping of a random child. This was something bigger, more dangerous. They moved to a nearby diner, bright and warm and safe, where Zara bought Minjun hot chocolate and sat with him while the officers made phone calls and filled out paperwork. The boy clung to her hand with surprising strength, as if she had become his anchor in a world that had suddenly turned threatening. As they sat in the bright fluorescent light, Minjun reached into his pocket and pulled out a small jade bracelet, the stone so perfectly green it seemed to glow. Korean characters were carved into the surface with exquisite precision, and even without being able to read them, Zara could tell this was something precious, something that marked him as belonging to a family of significant importance. He held it toward her, his expression solemn and strangely formal for such a young child. "You saved me," he said quietly. "That makes you family now. My father will want to thank you." Before Zara could respond, the diner's front window exploded in a wash of bright headlights. Black vehicles had surrounded the building, expensive SUVs with tinted windows that spoke of serious money and serious power. The few other customers in the diner looked up nervously as figures in dark suits emerged from the vehicles, moving with the coordinated precision of professional security. Minjun squeezed her hand tighter, but his expression had changed. The fear was gone, replaced by something that might have been relief or perhaps resignation. Zara realized with a chill that ran down her spine that the real players in this drama were about to make their entrance, and whatever happened next would change everything. The diner fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of expensive engines idling outside. Through the rain-streaked windows, Zara could see figures moving with military precision, their dark suits like uniforms in the harsh glare of headlights. The police officers who had been so confident moments before now stood with their hands hovering near their weapons, uncertain but clearly recognizing superior firepower when they saw it. The door opened without the traditional chime of bells. It simply swung inward, as if the very air had shifted to accommodate the man who entered. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled his perfectly tailored charcoal suit like armor. His face was sharp angles and controlled stillness, the kind of bone structure that photographers would kill for, but eyes that warned against getting too close. Everything about him radiated power held in perfect check, danger wrapped in silk and steel. Jean Woo-hyun stepped into the fluorescent brightness of the diner like a shadow given form. His presence changed the very atmosphere of the room, making it smaller, more intense, as if gravity itself had shifted to acknowledge his authority. Behind him came three men in identical suits, their faces professionally blank, but their eyes constantly scanning for threats. They positioned themselves with the unconscious precision of people who had done this countless times before. The lead police officer straightened her shoulders and approached with careful respect. "Sir, I need to ask you to identify yourself. We have a situation here with a minor child, and protocol requires us to verify any claims of guardianship." Woo Hyun's gaze moved over her with a detached assessment of a predator deciding whether something was worth his attention. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, and absolutely certain of being obeyed. "My name is Jean Woo-hyun. The child is my son. Your protocol has been noted and dismissed." He reached into his jacket with deliberate slowness, producing a leather wallet that probably cost more than most people made in a month. From it, he extracted documents that the officer examined with growing recognition and unease. Whatever she saw there made her step back and wave her partner away from his defensive position. Min-jun remained pressed against Zara's side, his small hand still clutching hers with desperate strength. She expected him to run to his father, to show relief at being rescued, but instead the boy seemed to shrink further into her protection. The disconnect between the child's reaction and the obvious wealth and power before them sent warning bells through her nursing instincts. Woo Hyun's dark eyes found his son and softened almost imperceptibly, the transformation so subtle that Zara almost missed it. The dangerous stranger became something else for just a moment, something vulnerable and deeply concerned. But when Min-jun made no move toward him, remaining fixed to Zara's side like a small magnet, the softness vanished behind a mask of controlled neutrality. He approached their table with the careful precision of someone accustomed to being feared, each step measured and deliberate. When he reached them, he lowered himself to Min-jun's eye level with fluid grace, his expensive suit not even creasing with the movement. His voice, when he addressed his son, carried undertones of warmth that contrasted sharply with the ice he had shown everyone else. "Min-jun," he said softly, speaking in accented English that carried the weight of careful education and old money. "Are you injured? Did they hurt you in any way?" The boy shook his head, but did not let go of Zara's hand. "They tried to take me, Appa, but she stopped them. She saved me." Woo Hyun's attention shifted to Zara for the first time, and she felt the full force of his assessment like a physical weight. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they moved over her with the methodical thoroughness of someone accustomed to reading people for threats, weaknesses, and useful information. She had the uncomfortable feeling that he was cataloging everything about her, from her rumpled scrubs to her exhausted posture to the way his son clung to her hand. "Your name," he said, and it was not quite a question, not quite a command, but something that expected an immediate answer nonetheless. "Zara Williams," she replied, meeting his gaze directly despite every instinct telling her to look away. "I'm a nurse at Harborview. I was walking home when I heard Min-jun in the alley. Those men were trying to take him. You intervened," he stated, still studying her with that unnerving intensity. "Why? What did you hope to gain from inserting yourself into a dangerous situation involving people you did not know?" The question caught her off guard with its cold calculation, as if the idea of helping a child without ulterior motive was somehow foreign to his experience. "Because he's a little boy who is scared and in danger," she said, her voice gaining strength. "That's what people do. We help each other." Something flickered across his features, so quickly that she might have imagined it. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something he had not expected to find. He straightened to his full height, and the moment of vulnerability was gone, replaced by the controlled authority that seemed to be his default state. "The men who attempted to take my son," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, belong to the Lee faction. "They are rivals of my family's business interests, and they will try again. They saw you intervene, which means they now consider you a threat to their operations." Your life is in danger because you chose to help a stranger. Zara felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of his words sank in. She had acted on instinct, doing what felt right in the moment. And somehow that simple choice had pulled her into something far larger and more dangerous than she could have imagined. The exhaustion that had been weighing her down was replaced by a sharp clarity that came with genuine fear. "What are you saying?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I am saying that you cannot return to your normal life until this threat has been permanently resolved," Woo Hyun replied with the calm certainty of someone delivering a weather report. "You will come with us to my compound, where you can be protected until the Leaf faction has been dealt with appropriately." The words hit her like cold water. "You can't be serious. I have a job, responsibilities. I can't just disappear because some criminals might be angry that I helped your son." His expression did not change, but something in his stillness suggested that very few people argued with his decisions. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice remaining perfectly level, "you misunderstand the nature of your situation. This is not a request or suggestion. The Leaf faction does not make idle threats, and they do not leave loose ends untied. You are now a loose end." Minjun tugged on her hand, his dark eyes wide with concern that seemed far too mature for his age. "Please come with us," he said quietly. "Apple will keep you safe. He keeps everyone safe." The police officers had finished their quiet conversation with Woo Hyun's security team and were now pointedly looking away, their body language suggesting that whatever authority they represented had been superseded by something larger and more powerful. Zara realized with growing unease that she had stumbled into a world where normal rules did not apply, where protection and imprisonment might be the same thing. Woo Hyun seemed to read her thoughts with uncomfortable accuracy. "You are not my prisoner, Miss Williams," he said, his tone carrying what might have been intended as reassurance. "You are my guest, under my protection, until the threat to your life has been eliminated. The distinction may seem subtle, but it is important to me that you understand it." "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. His smile was thin and held no warmth whatsoever. "Then you will likely be dead within 48 hours, and my son will have lost the woman who risked her life to save his. That outcome is unacceptable to me on multiple levels." The certainty in his voice made her stomach clench with fear. This was not a man given to exaggeration or dramatic gestures. When he stated facts, they carried the weight of absolute truth backed by resources she could not even imagine. Zara looked down at Minjun, who was watching her with those enormous dark eyes, and realized that her simple act of compassion had irrevocably changed the trajectory of her life. The ride to his compound passed in surreal silence. The interior of the luxury SUV insulated from the outside world by bulletproof glass and leather that probably cost more than her annual salary. Woo Hyun sat across from her with Minjun between them, his attention split between monitoring his son's emotional state and observing her reactions with that same unsettling intensity. Through the tinted windows, she watched Seattle transform from the familiar neighborhoods of her daily life into something altogether more exclusive and isolated. The buildings grew larger, the spaces between them wider, until they were traveling through an area of the city she had never seen before, where money and privacy created their own geography. When they finally passed through massive iron gates and up a circular drive lined with perfectly manicured trees, Zara understood that she had entered a world as foreign to her experience as another planet. The compound before her was a fortress disguised as elegance, all clean lines and expensive materials that spoke of power wielded with absolute confidence. As they stepped from the vehicle, Woo Hyun's voice carried the weight of established law. "You will have a suite of rooms in the East Wing," he informed her. "Meals will be provided, and anything you require will be obtained. The compound has extensive security, both for your protection and to ensure that information about our operations remains private. You are free to move about the grounds, but you will not leave without my explicit permission and appropriate security arrangements." "And how long will this last?" Zara asked, her voice steadier than she felt. His dark eyes met hers across the elegant foyer, and for just a moment she saw something that might have been regret. Until is finished, Miss Williams. Until they're no longer a threat to anyone I'm sworn to protect, including you. The compound revealed itself in layers as Zara followed a silent woman in an elegant gray uniform through corridors that managed to be both fortress and sanctuary. What had appeared from the outside to be cold modern architecture transformed within into something altogether more complex. A careful marriage of traditional Korean design elements and contemporary luxury that spoke of deep cultural roots and unlimited resources. Paper screens painted with delicate cherry blossoms divided spaces that flowed into each other with organic grace, while polished hardwood floors gleamed beneath her feet like still water. The scent of jasmine and sandalwood drifted through the air from hidden sources, creating an atmosphere of serene beauty that contrasted sharply with the armed guards she had glimpsed stationed at every entrance. Mrs. Chun, her guide explained in accented English, had been the household manager for 12 years. She was a small, efficient woman whose dark eyes held the kind of intelligence that missed nothing, and Zara suspected that very little happened within these walls without her knowledge and approval. The way she moved through the spaces with quiet authority suggested that she was more than just staff, perhaps more like family. "Your rooms are in the East Wing," as Mr. Jean requested, Mrs. Chun said, her voice carrying warmth that seemed genuine despite the formal circumstances. "The young master specifically asked that you be close to his quarters in case he has nightmares. He has become quite attached to you already." They passed through what appeared to be a traditional Korean courtyard, complete with a small pond where koi moved like living jewels beneath the surface. The rain had stopped, and early morning sunlight filtered through carefully placed windows, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted like breathing across the wooden floors. Zara realized that despite being essentially a prisoner, she had never been surrounded by such beauty. The staff they encountered moved with quiet efficiency, offering respectful bows that seemed directed as much toward Zara as to Mrs. Chun. Word had clearly spread about her role in Minjun's rescue, and she found herself being regarded with a mixture of gratitude and curious respect that made her uncomfortable. These people understood the value of what she had done in ways that went far beyond simple heroics. Mrs. Chun paused before an elegant doorway marked by intricate woodwork that looked like it belonged in a museum. "The household has been instructed to provide anything you might require," she said, her tone carrying undertones of something that might have been approval. "Mr. Jean values loyalty above all other qualities, and what you did for his son has earned you a place of honor here." The suite of rooms beyond the door took Zara's breath away with their understated elegance. A sitting area with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked gardens that seemed to stretch for acres, while a bedroom decorated in soft creams and golds felt more like a luxury hotel than a prison cell. Fresh flowers had been arranged on every surface, and she noticed that someone had already unpacked the few belongings that had been retrieved from her apartment. "Dinner is served at 7, Mrs. Chin informed her, her expression softening slightly. "The young master has specifically requested that you join the family. It would mean a great deal to him if you could be there." The word family hung in the air with particular weight, and Zara wondered exactly what role she was being asked to play in this carefully orchestrated world. The boundaries between guest, protectee, and something more intimate seemed deliberately blurred, as if Wu Hyun operated by rules that did not acknowledge conventional categories. When 7 o'clock arrived, Zara found herself in a dining room that managed to be both grand and intimate, dominated by a long table of dark polished wood that could have seated 20 but was set for only 3. Traditional Korean artwork adorned the walls, delicate paintings of mountains and rivers that seemed to breathe with life in the soft lighting. Wu Hyun entered precisely on time, and Zara was struck again by the controlled power of his presence. He had changed from his business suit into what appeared to be casual clothing, but even his relaxed attire spoke of expensive taste and careful attention to detail. Dark slacks and a simple white shirt somehow managed to make him look more dangerous rather than less, as if the formal armor of his suit had been replaced by something more fundamental and predatory. Minjun appeared moments later, freshly bathed and dressed in pajamas that probably cost more than most people spent on work clothes. His face lit up when he saw Zara, and he rushed to her with the uninhibited affection of a child who had decided she belonged to him. The contrast between his openness and his father's controlled reserve was striking. Two versions of the same genetic material, shaped by vastly different experiences. "You came," Minjun said with obvious delight, climbing into the chair beside hers with practiced ease. "Appa, she came to dinner just like I asked." "I can see that," Wu Hyun replied, his voice carrying undertones of amusement that transformed his entire face. "Miss Williams, I hope your accommodations are satisfactory. Mrs. Chun has specific instructions to ensure your comfort during your stay with us." The meal that followed was a revelation in subtle dynamics and unspoken communication. Wu Hyun proved to be an attentive host, ensuring that she understood each dish and its cultural significance. His explanations delivered with the kind of understated pride that spoke of deep connection to his heritage. But it was his interaction with Minjun that truly captured her attention. With his son, the dangerous stranger became something altogether different. Patient when Minjun spilled soup on his pajamas, gentle when correcting his table manners, genuinely engaged when the boy chattered about his day with the boundless enthusiasm of childhood. Zara watched this transformation with growing fascination, seeing glimpses of the man beneath the carefully maintained facade of lethal authority. "Tell Miss Zara about your drawing," Woo Hyun suggested, his voice carrying warmth that made him seem almost ordinary. "The one you worked on this afternoon while she was settling in." Minjun's face became animated with excitement as he described a picture he had created of the three of them standing in the garden, complete with stick figure representations and a sun that took up half the paper. In his 7-year-old interpretation of reality, they were already a family unit, connected by invisible bonds that he had simply accepted as natural and right. Zara felt something twist in her chest as she listened to his innocent chatter, a recognition of longing that she had not acknowledged even to herself. There is something profoundly appealing about this domestic scene, this glimpse of what family could look like when built on genuine affection rather than mere biological connection. The danger that surrounded them seemed distant and unreal compared to the immediate warmth of Minjun's laughter and his father's quiet attention. After dinner, as Mrs. Chan efficiently cleared the table, Woo Hyun excused himself to take a business call, leaving Zara alone with Minjun in the sitting room that adjoined the dining area. The boy curled up beside her on the elegant sofa with the easy intimacy of someone who had already decided she was safe and began to tell her about his school, his friends, and the pets he hoped to convince his father to allow. "He misses my mother," Minjun said suddenly, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper that children used when sharing important secrets. "She died when I was born, so he has been sad for a long time. But he smiles more since he came here. I think maybe you make him remember how to be happy." The simple observation hit her like a physical blow, carrying implications that she was not prepared to process. Before she could formulate any kind of response, Woo Hyun's voice drifted from somewhere deeper in the house, speaking in Korean with the kind of rhythmic cadence that suggested he was reading aloud. Minjun's face lit up with recognition and anticipation. "Bedtime story," he explained, scrambling down from the sofa with sudden energy. "Appa reads to me in Korean, so I don't forget our language. Do you want to come listen? He has a really good voice for stories." Curiosity won over caution, and Zara found herself following Minjun down a corridor lined with family photographs that told the story of his short life in careful detail. The pictures showed a progression from infant to toddler to school-age child, always with his father, but notably missing any maternal presence. Whatever had happened to Minjun's mother, her absence was a deliberate void in the visual narrative of their family. They reached Minjun's bedroom, a space that managed to be both luxurious and genuinely child-friendly, with expensive toys arranged alongside books and artwork that clearly came from school projects and amateur attempts at creativity. Woo Hyun sat on the edge of the small bed, a leather-bound book open in his hands, his voice carrying the musical quality of Korean poetry as he read. The sight of him there, dangerous and controlled and utterly gentle, reading bedtime stories to his son in their ancestral language, did something unexpected to Zara's carefully maintained emotional distance. This was not the cold criminal she had been prepared to fear and resist. This was a father, devoted and vulnerable, doing his best to raise a child in circumstances that most people would find impossible. Minjun climbed into bed with practiced efficiency, settling under covers that had probably been hand-embroidered by artisans whose names she would never know. Woo Hyun continued reading, his voice carrying emotion that the English language could not have conveyed, and Zara found herself leaning against the doorframe, caught in the intimate spell of the moment. When the story ended and Minjun had been kissed goodnight with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with every other aspect of Woo Hyun's public persona, father and guest found themselves walking back through the quiet corridors in companionable silence. The house had settled into its nighttime rhythm, and she was intensely aware of being alone with him for the first time since entering his world. "Your son is remarkable," Zara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper in deference to the sleeping child they had left behind. "He has such resilience, such joy, despite everything he must have witnessed living in your world." Woo Hyun stopped walking and turned to face her, his dark eyes reflecting light from the carefully placed fixtures that turned the corridor into something from a dream. "He is everything to me," he said simply, his voice carrying a weight of emotion that made her chest tighten with recognition. "When his mother died, bringing him into this world, I made a promise that he would know only love and safety, regardless of what that required from me." "But your world," she began, then stopped herself, uncertain how to articulate the moral complexity that his lifestyle represented. "How do you reconcile the violence, the danger, with wanting to protect him from those very things?" His expression became more guarded, but not defensive. "Everything I do," he said carefully, "serves the purpose of ensuring that my son grows up in a world where he is safe, where his future is secure, where no one can threaten what matters to me. Yes, there is violence in my world, but it is violence with purpose, applied strategically to eliminate threats before they can reach the people I am sworn to protect." "That's a very clean way to describe what amounts to organized crime," Zara replied, surprised by her own boldness in challenging him directly. Instead of anger, her words seemed to generate something that might have been respect. "You are not wrong," he acknowledged. "But consider this, Miss Williams. In your profession, you make life and death decisions every day. You choose who receives scarce resources, you determine which treatments to pursue, you sometimes allow people to die because saving them would prevent you from saving others. Is your violence somehow more moral because it is sanctioned by institutions rather than implemented by individuals?" The parallel he was drawing made her deeply uncomfortable because it contained enough truth to be genuinely challenging. In the emergency department, she had indeed made decisions that resulted in death for some patients while preserving life for others. The mathematics of triage were brutal and unforgiving, even when dressed in the language of medical ethics and professional standards. "We both protect people who cannot protect themselves," Woo Hyun continued, his voice carrying quiet conviction. "You use medicine and skill and institutional authority. I use money and connections and, when necessary, force. The methods differ, but the fundamental purpose is identical. We preserve what matters, regardless of cost." The conversation had moved into territory that threatened to undermine every assumption she had made about moral certainty and righteous judgment. Standing in this beautiful, dangerous house, looking at a man who read bedtime stories in Korean and commanded resources that could eliminate human beings with a phone call, Zara felt the solid ground of her convictions shifting beneath her feet. A soft chime from somewhere in the house interrupted the moment, and Woo Hyun's expression immediately became more alert, more focused. He pulled a phone from his pocket and glanced at the screen, his face hardening into the mask of controlled authority that she was beginning to recognize as his default response to business communications. "Excuse me," he said, his voice already distant with concentration. "I need to take this call. Mrs. Chan will be available if you require anything during the night." As he walked away, already speaking in rapid Korean to whoever had contacted him, Zara realized that Minjun had appeared in the corridor behind her, padding barefoot across the polished floors with the fearless navigation of a child in his own territory. "Is everything okay?" she asked, crouching down to his level with automatic concern. "Appa gets calls like this when there are problems with the business," Minjun explained with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had grown up understanding that his father's work involved complications that other families did not experience. "But he always fixes them. He fixes everything." Before she could respond, his small arms wrapped around her neck in an impulsive hug that carried the desperate affection of a child who had found something he was afraid of losing. "Can you stay with us forever?" he whispered against her shoulder. "I like having you here. It feels like we are a real family now." The innocent request hit her like a physical blow, carrying implications that she was not prepared to process. Over his shoulder, she could see Woo Hyun in the distance, his phone pressed to his ear, his entire posture radiating the controlled tension of someone receiving news that would require immediate and decisive action. Whatever information he was receiving, it was changing the landscape of their situation in ways she could not yet understand. As she held Minjun and tried to formulate some kind of response to his heartbreaking request, Zara realized that the simple act of saving a child from an alley had pulled her into something far more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined. She was no longer just a witness to this strange world of luxury and violence. She was becoming part of its emotional architecture, essential to the happiness of a little boy who had decided that she belonged to him. The phone call ended, and Woo Hyun's footsteps echoed through the quiet house as he returned to them, his expression carrying the weight of new information that would undoubtedly complicate their already precarious situation. When he reached them, his eyes moved between her face and his son's trusting embrace, and she saw something flicker across his features that might have been recognition of a problem that went far beyond external threats and business rivalries. "The Lee faction has accelerated their timeline," he said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled calm of someone accustomed to delivering bad news. "They are moving faster than anticipated, which means our window for resolving this situation has become significantly smaller. I am afraid, Miss Williams, that your stay with us may be longer than any of us originally anticipated." 3 days settled into a rhythm that felt dangerously close to normal. If normal included armed guards at every entrance and conversations conducted in languages she couldn't understand but learned to interpret through tone and body language. Zara found herself slipping into the household routine with an ease that should have alarmed her more than it did, helping Minjun with his morning routine, sharing meals that grew progressively less formal, and discovering that luxury became ordinary with surprising speed. She had established herself in the small library adjacent to her suite, a room lined with books in multiple languages and furnished with chairs that seemed designed for long afternoons of reading. Minjun had claimed the spot beside her window as his homework territory, spreading his school materials across the polished wood table while she reviewed medical journals that Mrs. Chun somehow managed to acquire for her. The domesticity of it was seductive in ways she had not anticipated. Watching Minjun practice his English letters, while occasionally looking up to share a story or ask for help with pronunciation, created an intimacy that felt more real than many relationships she had maintained for years. He was a bright child, curious and affectionate, with an intuitive understanding of adult emotions that probably came from growing up in a world where reading people correctly was a survival skill. Woo Hyun appeared in the library doorway Tuesday morning, his presence announced by the subtle shift in energy that seemed to precede him everywhere. He wore dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a concession to casualness that somehow made him appear more formidable rather than less. Minjun looked up from his workbook and smiled with the automatic warmth of a child secure in his father's love. "Miss Williams," Woo Hyun said, his formal address maintaining the careful distance that seemed to govern all their interactions outside of family dinner conversations. "I wondered if you might assist with a medical concern. One of my security staff sustained an injury during training, and your professional expertise would be appreciated." The request surprised her, not because it was unreasonable, but because it suggested he was beginning to see her as something more than just a protected asset. She followed him through corridors she was still learning to navigate, noting the way household staff moved aside with respectful acknowledgement that included her in their deference. Word had clearly spread about her acceptance into the family dynamic, and her status in the compound hierarchy was evolving in ways she was only beginning to understand. The injured man was young, perhaps 25, with the kind of physical conditioning that spoke of serious martial arts training and the stoic expression that suggested he was deeply embarrassed to need medical attention. The cut on his forearm was clean but deep, clearly requiring sutures that the basic first aid protocols available to security teams could not provide. Zara examined the wound with practiced efficiency, her professional training taking precedence over the surreal circumstances of treating a patient in what was essentially a private army facility. The injury was straightforward, but it required careful cleaning and precise stitching that she could perform easily with the right supplies. She looked up to find Wu Hyun, watching her work with the same intense attention he seemed to apply to everything that interested him. "I can close this properly," she told the injured man, whose name tag identified him as Park. "But I need a suture kit and some local anesthetic. This is going to hurt quite a bit without proper pain management." "Mrs. Chun will obtain whatever you require," Woo Hyun replied, already reaching for his phone with the automatic assumption that any problem he identified would be immediately solved by the application of appropriate resources. "What else do you need to establish a basic medical treatment capability here?" The question caught her off guard with its implications. "Are you asking me to set up a medical facility?" she asked, looking up from her patient to study his expression for clues about his intentions. "I am asking what would be required to ensure that people under my protection have access to professional medical care without the complications of outside hospital visits," he replied, his tone suggesting that this was a practical consideration rather than any kind of long-term assumption about her presence. Given current circumstances, such capability would be valuable for multiple reasons. Within an hour, she had everything she needed to properly treat Park's injury, including supplies that must have cost more than most emergency departments spend in a month. As she worked, cleaning and suturing with careful precision, she was aware of Woo Hyun's continued presence at the edge of her vision. He did not watch like someone monitoring her performance, but like someone learning something important about her capabilities and character. When she finished, Park bowed with formal gratitude that seemed to encompass more than just medical treatment, as if her willingness to help had earned her a place in some complex system of loyalty and obligation that governed relationships within Woo Hyun's organization. The respect in his eyes was genuine, and she realized that her actions were being interpreted through cultural frameworks she was only beginning to understand. "Thank you," Woo Hyun said simply as they walked back through the quiet corridors. "That was skillfully done. Park will recover completely because of your intervention." "It's what I do," Zara replied, then found herself adding, "though I have to admit this is probably the most luxurious treatment facility I've ever worked in. Your compound makes most hospital emergency departments look like third-world clinics." His rare smile transformed his entire face, making him appear younger and infinitely more approachable. "Money has its advantages," he acknowledged, "but skill cannot be purchased. What you did required training, experience, and natural ability. Those qualities are far more valuable than expensive equipment." They had reached the point where the corridor branched toward the family wing, and he paused as if uncertain whether their professional interaction had concluded or evolved into something more personal. Zara found herself studying his face in the natural light that filtered through carefully placed windows, noting details that formal business interactions had not allowed her to observe. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and responsibility, and a small scar near his left temple that suggested his life had not always been as controlled and protected as it appeared now. "Let me see your hands," she said suddenly, her nursing instincts triggered by something in his posture that suggested discomfort. "You favored your right hand while we were working, and I noticed you grimace when you reached for your phone." "I am fine," he replied automatically, the response of someone accustomed to handling physical discomfort without assistance or complaint. "Let me be the judge of that," Zara said firmly, stepping closer with the professional authority she used when patients tried to minimize serious symptoms. "I just spent an hour suturing someone else's injury. I know what I'm looking at when someone is hurt." He extended his right hand with obvious reluctance, and she could immediately see the problem. A cut across his palm, probably from broken glass, that had been inadequately cleaned and was showing early signs of infection. The kind of injury that men often ignored until it became serious enough to interfere with their ability to function. "When did this happen?" she asked, examining the wound with gentle fingers that nevertheless made him tense with obvious discomfort. "Yesterday," he admitted. "A glass broke during a business meeting that became more animated than anticipated. It seemed minor at the time, and now it's infected," Zara observed, looking up to meet his eyes and suddenly becoming intensely aware of how close they were standing. His face was perhaps 12 inches from hers, close enough that she could see the individual lashes that framed his dark eyes and catch the subtle scent of sandalwood and something uniquely masculine that made her pulse accelerate in ways that had nothing to do with medical adrenaline. The moment stretched between them, loaded with awareness that neither seemed prepared to acknowledge or act upon. His hand in hers was warm and surprisingly gentle for someone whose reputation suggested casual familiarity with violence. She could feel his pulse beneath her fingers, steady but elevated, matching her own body's recognition of proximity and possibility. "This needs to be cleaned properly and treated with antibiotics," she said finally, her voice not quite as steady as she intended. "If you ignore it, you could end up with blood poisoning, which would be a remarkably stupid way for someone in your position to create vulnerability." His smile at her blunt assessment carried genuine amusement. "Very well, Dr. Williams. I submit to your professional expertise. But perhaps we could handle this somewhere more private than a hallway where anyone might observe the head of the Huang family receiving medical treatment for a minor injury." They ended up in his private study, a room that managed to be both intimidating and inviting, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive desk that seemed designed to reinforce the authority of whoever sat behind it. As she cleaned his wound with careful thoroughness, applying antibiotic cream and proper bandaging, Zara found herself intensely aware of the intimacy of the moment. This was not a professional medical interaction in a hospital setting, but something more personal, more charged with possibility and danger. "You have gentle hands," Wu Hyun observed quietly, his voice carrying undertones that made her stomach flutter with nervous energy. "Most people in my world are accustomed to handling problems with force. Gentleness is a rarer quality, and therefore more valuable." Before she could formulate any response to what might have been a compliment or simply an observation, Minjun's voice echoed from somewhere in the house, calling for both of them with the expectant tone of a child who assumed that the adults he loved would always be available when he needed them. They found him in the main sitting room, surrounded by art supplies and working on what appeared to be a family portrait that featured 3 figures standing in front of a house that looked remarkably like the compound. His technique was improving with practice, and the composition showed a sophistication that suggested artistic talent beyond typical childhood scribbling. "Look," he announced proudly, holding up the paper for their inspection. "It's us. I made Zara the same size as Appa, because she's important too, and I put us all holding hands because that's what families do." The innocent statement hit the room like a small explosion, creating a moment of silence that stretched uncomfortably as both adults processed the implications of a 7-year-old's casual assumption about their relationship status. Zara felt heat rise in her cheeks as she studied the drawing, noting that Minjun had indeed portrayed them as a unified family unit, connected by physical touch and positioned in front of what he clearly considered their shared home. "That's a beautiful picture, sweetheart," she managed finally, her voice carefully neutral despite the emotional turbulence that Minjun's words had triggered. "You're getting much better at drawing people. These actually look like real faces instead of circles with dots." Minjun beamed at the praise, then turned to his father with the expectant expression of a child seeking approval from the most important person in his universe. "Do you like it, Appa? I want to hang it in the dining room so everyone can see our family." Woo Hyun's expression was carefully controlled, but Zara caught something that might have been longing flicker across his features before he composed himself into neutrality. "It is excellent work, Minjun," he said carefully. "Your artistic skills are developing very well. But perhaps we should discuss where to display it after Miss Zara has had time to see it properly." The diplomatic response managed to avoid directly addressing Minjun's assumption while not crushing his obvious joy in creating something that represented his deepest wishes. But the careful distance in Woo Hyun's words created a subtle tension that Minjun was too young to understand but old enough to sense. Dinner that evening carried an undercurrent of awareness that had not been present in their previous family meals. Minjun chattered with his usual enthusiasm, but both adults were more conscious of the domestic picture they presented. The way their interaction around his needs and interests created the appearance of genuine partnership. When Zara laughed at one of Minjun's stories about his school friends, she caught Woo Hyun watching her with an expression of such unguarded warmth that her breath caught in her throat. The moment was interrupted by the discreet appearance of one of his security personnel, who approached the table with the kind of controlled urgency that suggested important business requiring immediate attention. Woo Hyun excused himself with apologies, but not before she saw his expression shift into the mask of deadly focus that she was learning to associate with threats to their carefully maintained sanctuary. When he returned 20 minutes later, his face was grim with news that clearly altered their situation in fundamental ways. "The Lee faction has moved beyond surveillance and planning," he announced without preamble. "They have begun active operations aimed at destabilizing our security arrangements. This compound is no longer just a protective measure. It is now under active threat." "What does that mean?" Zara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer and would not like it. "It means that your freedom of movement, which was already limited, must now be further restricted for your safety," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of decisions she would not be allowed to influence. "It means that the timeline for resolving this situation has accelerated beyond our original projections. And it means that leaving this compound, for any reason, is no longer a possibility until this threat has been permanently eliminated." The careful distance she had been maintaining between her growing attachment to this strange family and the reality of her situation collapsed under the weight of his words. She was not a guest who might eventually return to her normal life. She was a prisoner whose cage had just become smaller and more secure, regardless of how comfortable or luxurious that cage might be. "For how long?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "How long before I can go back to my real life, my job, my apartment, my friends?" His dark eyes met hers across the elegant dining room, and she saw something that might have been regret or possibly something more complicated and dangerous. "I do not know, Miss Williams," he said quietly, "but I can tell you this much. The thought of you leaving, of returning to a world where I cannot protect you, has become more difficult for me to accept than I anticipated when this arrangement began." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was prepared to cross, loaded with implications that would change everything if acknowledged directly. Minjun, oblivious to the adult tensions swirling around him, continued eating his dessert with the contentment of a child secure in the belief that the people he loved would always be there to keep him safe. Outside the protected walls of the compound, Zara knew that dangerous people were making plans that would determine her future in ways she could not control or influence. But inside this beautiful prison, surrounded by luxury and care and the growing awareness that her feelings for both the man and his son were becoming more complex than simple gratitude or Stockholm Syndrome, she found herself confronting a question that had no safe answer. What happened when the cage became so comfortable that you stopped wanting the key? Dawn had always been Zara's favorite time in the compound, when the early light turned the traditional screens into luminous art and the gardens seemed to breathe with peaceful possibility. She had developed a routine of rising early to drink coffee in the small sitting area of her suite while watching the koi move through their pond like living meditation. The silence felt sacred, broken only by the distant sounds of the household staff beginning their daily preparations. The first gunshot shattered that piece like glass exploding in reverse, followed immediately by the harsh wail of alarms that turned the serene morning into mechanical chaos. Zara dropped her coffee cup, the delicate porcelain shattering against the hardwood floor as her body responded to the emergency signals with trained medical precision. Adrenaline flooded her system, sharpening her vision and accelerating her heartbeat as years of hospital emergency protocols kicked into automatic response. The compound transformed around her with terrifying efficiency. Steel shutters slammed down over windows with metallic finality. Emergency lighting activated in harsh red strips that turned familiar corridors into something from a nightmare. The gentle household staff she had grown to care for moved with practiced speed toward predetermined safe areas, their faces calm with the kind of preparation that came from extensive drilling. Mrs. Chun appeared in her doorway, no longer the elegant household manager, but a woman clearly accustomed to crisis situations requiring immediate, decisive action. She carried a radio that crackled with urgent communications in multiple languages, and her expression held the focused intensity of someone coordinating complex emergency procedures under extreme pressure. "Secure room. Now," she said without preamble, her accented English sharp with urgency. "Young master is already there. Mr. Jin's orders are absolute. You protect the child until he arrives." Zara followed Mrs. Chun through corridors that had become an obstacle course of defensive preparations. Security personnel moved past them like shadows, armed and focused, their faces professionally blank, but their movements betraying the controlled tension of soldiers preparing for battle. The beautiful home had revealed its secondary purpose as a fortress, every elegant detail hiding protective capabilities that most people would never suspect. The secure room was located in the center of the compound, surrounded by walls that Mrs. Chun explained were reinforced with materials capable of stopping armor-piercing rounds. The entrance required multiple security protocols, including biometric scanning and encrypted key codes, technology that seemed borrowed from science fiction movies rather than residential architecture. Minjun waited inside, dressed in pajamas and clutching a stuffed tiger with the fierce determination of a child trying to be brave. His dark eyes were wide with fear, but his composure was remarkable for someone his age. When he saw Zara, relief flooded his small features, and he ran to her with the desperate energy of someone who had found safety in chaos. "The bad men came back," he whispered against her shoulder as she knelt to hold him. "But Appa said you would keep me safe until he can fix everything. He always fixes everything." His absolute faith in his father's ability to handle any threat was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Zara settled them both on a small sofa that had been positioned to avoid direct lines of sight from the single reinforced window, and began the process of keeping them both calm, while whatever was happening outside played out beyond their control. The room was equipped with everything necessary for extended occupation during security emergencies: food, water, medical supplies, communication equipment, and entertainment options for a child who might need distraction during prolonged confinement. Someone had planned for exactly this scenario, which suggested that attacks on the compound were not unprecedented events, but calculated risks that came with Woo Hyun's position and lifestyle. Through the communication system, she could hear fragments of radio traffic that painted a picture of coordinated assault by multiple teams attempting simultaneous breach at different entry points. Professional terminology mixed with urgent Korean as defenders responded to threats that seemed to materialize faster than they could be eliminated. This was not random violence, but carefully planned military-style operation with specific objectives. Minjun pressed closer to her side as the sounds of gunfire became more frequent and closer to their location. She could feel his small body trembling with fear despite his attempts to appear brave, and her protective instincts engaged with fierce intensity. Medical training included pediatric psychology, and she knew that his emotional response to this trauma could have lasting effects if not properly managed. "Tell me about your tiger," she said quietly, focusing his attention on the stuffed animal he clutched with white-knuckled determination. "What's his name? Does he have special powers that help keep you safe?" "His name is Young," Minjun whispered, his voice steadier when given something specific to discuss. "It means brave in Korean. Appa gave him to me when I was little and had bad dreams. Young fights monsters so I can sleep safely." The conversation continued in whispers as explosions echoed through the compound structure, each impact making the reinforced room shake slightly despite its protective design. Zara found herself creating increasingly elaborate stories about Yang's adventures, engaging Minjun's imagination as a shield against the terrifying reality of armed conflict happening just beyond their sanctuary walls. 30 minutes into the attack, the radio communications became more urgent and fragmented. She caught enough English mixed with Korean to understand that the outer perimeter had been breached and defensive teams were falling back to secondary positions. Whatever was happening outside, the attackers were making progress toward their objective, which she suspected was either elimination of Wu Hyun or acquisition of his son for leverage. "Where's Appa?" Minjun asked, his voice small with worry that he could no longer completely suppress. "Why hasn't he come to get us yet?" "He's making sure all the bad men are gone before it's safe to come here," Zara replied with confidence she did not entirely feel. "Your father is very good at protecting people. He would never let anything happen to you." The words were barely out of her mouth when the lights went out, plunging them into absolute darkness broken only by the faint red glow of emergency power strips. The sudden blindness was disorienting and terrifying, made worse by the immediate silence that followed as all electronic systems seemed to shut down simultaneously. Someone had cut power to this section of the compound, which meant they were now isolated from communication and dependent entirely on the physical security of their location. Minjun's frightened whimper was almost lost in the darkness, but Zara felt him press against her side with desperate trust. She fumbled for the emergency flashlight that Mrs. Chun had shown her during their brief orientation. Its beam created a small circle of normalcy in what felt like the end of the world. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice carrying calm confidence that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. "This is just part of the security system. The room is designed to keep us safe even if the power goes out. We just have to wait a little longer for your father to handle the problem." The metallic sound of something being inserted into the door lock made them both freeze with terror. Someone was attempting to breach their sanctuary using tools and techniques that suggested professional expertise rather than random violence. The secure room that had seemed impregnable was being methodically compromised by people who clearly understood its design and limitations. Zara's medical training included basic emergency response procedures, but nothing had prepared her for the possibility of armed intruders while responsible for a child's safety. Her mind raced through options as the sound of power tools began to echo through the small space, accompanied by sparks that flickered through gaps in the door frame like deadly fireflies. They were running out of time, and Wu Hyun was not coming. The medical supplies, she realized suddenly. The emergency kit contained sedatives powerful enough to incapacitate an adult patient, drugs that she was qualified to administer, but that could be lethal if used incorrectly. It was a desperate plan with enormous risk, but the alternative was waiting passively for armed intruders to complete their breach and do whatever they intended with a 7-year-old child. "Minjun," she whispered urgently, "I need you to hide behind the sofa and stay there no matter what happens. Can you do that for me? Can you be as brave as Young and stay hidden until your father comes?" He nodded with the solemn determination of a child who understood that adult desperation meant real danger, and scrambled into the narrow space between the sofa and the reinforced wall. Zara positioned herself beside the door with a syringe filled with enough pentobarbital to drop a grown man in seconds, her hand steady with the kind of focus that came from years of making life-and-death decisions under pressure. The door exploded inward with violent force, sending fragments of reinforced material across the small room like shrapnel. A figure in tactical gear rushed through the opening, weapon raised, eyes scanning for targets with professional efficiency. He was larger than she had expected, moving with the controlled aggression of someone accustomed to violence and confident in his ability to handle whatever resistance he might encounter. Zara stepped out of the shadows behind him and drove the syringe into his neck with all the force she could generate, depressing the plunger completely before he could react to her presence. The drug hit his system like a freight train, and she watched his eyes widen with surprise and then confusion as his nervous system began shutting down in rapid sequence. He collapsed with the heavy finality of unconscious weight, his weapon clattering across the floor as his motor control simply ceased to function. The entire encounter had lasted perhaps 15 seconds, but Zara felt as if she had aged years in the space of those critical moments. Minjun emerged from his hiding place with the cautious movements of someone checking to see if the world had returned to safety, his eyes wide with amazement and relief. "You stopped him," he said with the wonder of a child witnessing something impossible. "You protected us, just like Applewood." Before she could respond, footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond their compromised sanctuary, and her heart stopped as she realized there might be additional attackers following the first. She grabbed the unconscious man's weapon with hands that barely shook, her medical training automatically checking the safety mechanisms while her mind tried to process the surreal reality of preparing to shoot someone in defense of a child she had known for less than a week. The figure that appeared in the destroyed doorway was not another intruder, but Wu Hyun himself, his expensive suit torn and stained with what might have been blood, his face carrying the cold mask of someone who had just finished eliminating multiple threats with extreme prejudice. He took in the scene with a single glance that missed nothing, his eyes moving from the unconscious attacker to the weapon in her hands to his son standing safely behind her. For a moment, his carefully maintained control cracked completely, and she saw something raw and devastating flicker across his features. Relief, gratitude, and something else that might have been recognition of a debt that could never be adequately repaid. His hands were shaking slightly as he moved toward them, and she realized that for the first time since she had known him, Jin Woo-hyun looked genuinely vulnerable. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion that he was no longer able to completely suppress. "Either of you? Did they hurt you in any way?" "We're fine," Zara replied, setting down the weapon with careful movements as adrenaline began to fade and leave her feeling hollow and exhausted. Minjun was incredibly brave. He did exactly what I asked him to do. Woo-hyun knelt beside his son and gathered him into an embrace that spoke of desperate relief and fierce protectiveness, his expensive clothing forgotten as he held the most precious thing in his world. Minjun clung to his father with the desperate affection of a child who had been genuinely frightened but never doubted that rescue would eventually come. Over his son's head, Woo-hyun's dark eyes met hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten with recognition. "You protected him," he said quietly, his voice carrying weight that went far beyond simple gratitude. "You risked your life to keep him safe when I could not be here to do it myself." The admission cost him something significant, she realized. This was a man accustomed to being in control, to protecting rather than relying on protection from others. Having his son's safety depend on her actions while he was fighting for their lives elsewhere represented a vulnerability that he would not have accepted under any other circumstances. "The Leaf faction has been eliminated," he continued, his voice returning to the controlled authority she was used to hearing from him, though undertones of exhaustion suggested the cost had been significant. "Their leadership, their operational capability, their financial resources. They will never threaten anyone in this family again." "And us?" Zara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer and was not certain she wanted to hear it confirmed. "You are safe," he replied, then paused as if considering how much truth to reveal. "But you are also family now, in ways that go beyond the circumstances that brought you here. What happened today has changed things. It has changed everything." The word family hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither seemed prepared to fully examine. Minjun looked up at both of them with the satisfied expression of a child who had just seen his deepest wishes confirmed by adult acknowledgement, and Zara realized that the cage she had been so concerned about escaping had just transformed into something altogether more complicated and dangerous. A choice that she would have to make with full knowledge of its consequences, and with the understanding that some doors, once walked through, could never be opened in reverse. The compound transformed over the following week from fortress under siege to elegant home undergoing careful restoration. Construction crews worked with quiet efficiency to repair the damage from the attack, their presence a reminder of violence that already felt distant and unreal. Zara found herself watching the restoration process with fascination, noting how quickly physical evidence of trauma could be erased while emotional scars took longer to heal. Minjun had recovered from the attack with the resilience that seemed natural to children, though she noticed he stayed closer to both her and his father, reluctant to be alone even in familiar spaces. His artwork had taken on new themes, drawings that featured protective figures in secure houses surrounded by walls that no monsters could breach. The innocence he had lost could not be restored, but the love that surrounded him seemed to provide adequate compensation. Wu Hyun had returned to his usual controlled demeanor, though she caught glimpses of something deeper in unguarded moments when he thought no one was observing. The way he looked at her during family meals carried gratitude and recognition that went far beyond simple appreciation for her protection of his son. She had become something essential to his world, though neither of them seemed prepared to acknowledge that transformation directly. The conversation she had been dreading came on a Tuesday morning as she sat in the library reviewing medical journals that Mrs. Chun continued to acquire with mysterious efficiency. Wu Hyun appeared in the doorway with a formal bearing that usually preceded important business discussions, his expression carefully neutral in ways that immediately put her on alert. The Lee faction threat has been completely eliminated, he began without preamble, his voice carrying the controlled authority she had learned to associate with pronouncements that would change everything. Their organizational structure has been dismantled, their financial resources redirected, and their leadership permanently neutralized. You are no longer in any danger from that source or any other related to your intervention on Minjun's behalf. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge she was not certain she wanted to cross. She had known this moment would come eventually, but the reality of complete freedom felt more complicated than the simple relief she had expected to experience. What does that mean exactly? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer and was not certain she was prepared to hear it confirmed. It means that your protection arrangement is formally concluded, Wu Hyun replied, his voice maintaining perfect neutrality despite what might have been tension in his posture. You are free to return to your previous life without restriction or concern for your safety. Mrs. Chun has prepared documentation that will explain your absence to your employer and ensure that your position remains available should you choose to resume your nursing career. The efficiency of the arrangements should not have surprised her, but something about his formal tone and careful distance felt wrong after everything they had shared during the past weeks. This was not the man who had read Korean bedtime stories to his son or shown genuine vulnerability after nearly losing everything that mattered to him. This was the controlled stranger she had first met, offering her freedom with the same detached courtesy he might use to conclude any business transaction. And if I choose to stay? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. What would that arrangement look like? His carefully maintained composure slipped slightly, revealing something that might have been hope struggling against expectation of disappointment. That would depend entirely on your reasons for staying, he said carefully. If you remained out of gratitude or obligation, the arrangement would be unsustainable for everyone involved. If you remained for other reasons, then we would need to discuss what kind of future you might envision here. The careful diplomatic language was frustrating in its refusal to acknowledge the emotional reality that had developed between them, but she recognized it as protection against vulnerability that could not be easily recovered from if rejected. He was offering her complete freedom while simultaneously hoping she would choose to surrender it voluntarily, a paradox that required enormous courage from someone accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment. Before she could formulate any response to his indirect proposition, Minjun burst into the library with the uncomplicated energy of a child who had just made an important discovery. He carried a piece of paper that he thrust toward them with obvious pride, his face glowing with satisfaction over whatever artistic achievement he had just completed. "Look," he announced happily, "I finished the family portrait. Now I can hang it in the dining room like I wanted." The drawing had evolved significantly from his earlier attempt, showing improved technique and more sophisticated understanding of proportion and detail. But the emotional content remained exactly the same. 3 figures standing together in front of the compound, holding hands with the connected certainty of people who belong to each other permanently and completely. Zara felt something break open in her chest as she studied the innocent artwork, recognizing that a 7-year-old child had somehow managed to articulate the truth that 2 adults had been too frightened to acknowledge directly. This was not a temporary arrangement or protective contract. This was a family that had formed through circumstances neither could have anticipated, but that both had chosen to nurture despite every rational argument against such emotional investment. "Minjun," she said gently, her voice thick with emotion she could no longer suppress, "what happens if I have to go back to my old house? Would you be okay without me here?" His face crumpled with the devastation of a child confronting the possibility of losing something precious without understanding why such loss might be necessary. "No," he whispered, his dark eyes filling with tears that he tried to blink away with fierce determination. "You can't leave. You're my family now. Families stay together." The simple declaration hit the room like a confession of absolute truth that could no longer be denied or diplomatically avoided. Wu Hyun's carefully maintained neutrality finally cracked completely, and she saw raw emotion flood his features as he looked between his son and the woman who had somehow become essential to both their happiness. "Minjun is correct," he said quietly, his voice carrying vulnerability that made her chest tighten with recognition. "You have become family in ways that go beyond circumstances or contracts. The thought of you leaving, of returning to a life where I cannot ensure your safety and happiness, has become unacceptable to me for reasons that have nothing to do with obligation or gratitude." "Tell me what those reasons are," Zara said, stepping closer to him with courage she had not known she possessed. "Tell me directly, without diplomatic language or protective distance. What do you want from me? What are you offering in return?" His dark eyes met hers with intensity that made her pulse accelerate with anticipation and possibility. "I want you to stay because I have fallen in love with your strength, your compassion, your willingness to risk everything to protect someone who needed you," he said, his voice gaining conviction with each word. "I want you to marry me, to become Minjun's mother legally as well as emotionally, to build a future where our family is complete and permanent." "And my career?" Zara asked, though she was already certain of her answer. "My independence? My identity as something other than just your wife?" His smile carried warmth that transformed his entire face from dangerous stranger to beloved partner. "Your strength is why I love you," he replied simply. "I would never want to change the qualities that make you extraordinary. Whatever future we build together must honor who you are, not require you to become someone different. Your nursing career, your independence, your identity, all of these things are essential parts of the woman I want to spend my life loving and protecting." The proposal was everything she had not known she wanted, offered by a man who understood that true partnership required mutual respect rather than possession. She thought of her old life, her small apartment, her hospital shifts, her careful routine of controlled solitude, and realized that none of it held any appeal compared to the possibility of building something meaningful with the people who had somehow become the center of her world. "Yes," she said simply, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "Yes to all of it, to staying, to marriage, to becoming Minjun's mother, to building a future together. Yes to choosing love over safety, to taking the risk of believing that impossible things can become real if enough people commit to making them work." Minjun's whoop of joy broke the emotional tension with pure childhood celebration, and he launched himself at both adults with the unconscious assumption that they would catch him and hold him safely between them. The three-way embrace that followed felt like the culmination of everything that had been building since that night in the alley. The transformation of rescue and protection into chosen family and permanent commitment. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the compound gardens, a ceremony that blended Korean traditions with elements from her own heritage in ways that honored both their backgrounds while creating something entirely new. Minjun served as ring-bearer with solemn pride, carrying symbols that transformed forced proximity into chosen partnership, protection into devotion, circumstances into destiny. Have you ever felt like you were meant to find exactly what you didn't know you were looking for? Share in the comments how this story of unexpected love and chosen family resonated with your own journey. The reception was intimate, attended by household staff who had become extended family and business associates who understood that this marriage represented more than personal happiness. It was a declaration of alliance, a statement of permanent commitment that would influence loyalties and obligations throughout Woo Hyun's organization for years to come. As evening fell over the celebration, Zara found herself standing beside her new husband in the garden where they had first begun to understand that their initial arrangement had evolved into something neither could have anticipated. Minjun played nearby with careful supervision from Mrs. Chun, his laughter carrying across the peaceful landscape like a promise of joy that would always find ways to flourish despite surrounding dangers. "Do you have any regrets?" Woo Hyun asked quietly, his hand finding hers with a natural intimacy of partners who had learned to trust each other completely. "About the life you left behind, the simplicity you gave up to join this complicated world?" Zara considered the question seriously, thinking about the path that had led from a dark alley to this garden ceremony, from rescuing a stranger child to accepting the role of mother and wife in a family built from courage and choice rather than conventional expectations. The life she had lived before seemed like it had belonged to someone else, someone smaller and more afraid than the woman who now stood in designer silk accepting responsibilities that would have terrified her former self. "None," she replied with conviction that surprised her with its absoluteness. "I found exactly what I didn't know I was looking for. I found home in people rather than places, safety in love rather than solitude, purpose in protecting family rather than just serving patients. Everything that brought me here was necessary to become who I was supposed to be." His smile carried satisfaction and relief and promises of shared tomorrows that stretched ahead with infinite possibility. The dangerous world that surrounded them would always exist, but it had been balanced by love strong enough to transform protection into partnership, necessity into choice, strangers into family. In the distance, Minjun called for them to come see something wonderful he had discovered in the garden, his voice bright with the confidence of a child secure in the knowledge that the adults who loved him would always respond to his need for their attention and participation in his joy. Together, they walked toward their son through gardens that had become the foundation for a love story that neither could have imagined but both had chosen to write with their lives.